Right, eat your biscuit, and then we'll get started.
My Transylvania twist.
It's now the mash,
It's now the Monster
the
Mash,
monster mash.
and it's a graveyard
It's
smash.
now the mash,
It's caught on in a flash.
it's now the mash.
Welcome to Joel and Josh's Amazing Creatures.
Where we take your fantasies and drag them grotesquely through reality.
I'm Josh,
And I'm Joel.
and in this episode, we will be tackling one of our personal favourite mythical creatures. I think it was one of the very first ones we thought of doing, aside from the
Yeah,
obvious...
the dragon was the first one. This was the second one, and it was an obvious one and a good choice.
We are going to be doing Griffins. Now, a lot of you will know of Griffins and hippogriffs from various mythologies, as well as the ever-popular and thoroughly mentioned on this show Harry Potter series, where, of course, there's Buckbeak, the famous griffin.
He was a hippogriff.
Oh, was Buckbeak a hippogriff?
Yeah.
Well, on that note, would you care to explain the differences between Griffins and hippogriffs? Because I personally was a bit shaky on this.
The difference is really, both of them have got the front half of a giant eagle. It's the back half that's different. With griffins, the back half is that of a lion, and with hippogriffs, it's that of a horse.
Okay, so a horse and a lion, and is that where the name difference comes in as well?
Yes, hippogriff, because hippo is a Greek word, but it was used by the Romans when naming the hippopotamus. They went to Africa, saw these horse-like heads bobbing up from the water, and said, that's like the things the Greeks mentioned. The water horse, the hippopotamus.
So, hippo means horse then, essentially, so
Yes.
hippogriff is like a horse griffin, by all accounts. So, with that note, we are doing, in fact, griffins. We are not going, we're not stabilising this episode, we're keeping it strictly jungle, well, more savannah, I would say.
Yeah.
And going with a lion-esque back half. Now, one thing I feel we should stress at the beginning of this episode is, as with a lot of mythical creatures, there is, like, certain combinations of animals used. For example, oh, it's at the head of an eagle and the back half of a lion. Oh, it's got the body of a human with snakes for hair. And we're going to take some liberties with this to the extent where we're not actually going to biologically stick a lion and a eagle together, because that just won't work.
And the ethics committee would have a field day with that.
Yeah, and we don't want to do that again. So what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and make it look as much like those components as possible in order to keep the mythos with it. However, it's not actually technically going to be a lion's arse on it, is it?
No, it's going to resemble that of a mammal, most likely some kind of large cat.
So, on the topic of what we're using to combine two animals in a sense to make this griffin, our first big issue with this was, in fact, the number of limbs, which is a similar issue to what we had in our dragon episode. Now, unlike our dragon episode, we did not want to make this an insect, because we can't just keep doing that. So, effectively, there are no six-limbed vertebrates, are there? You were mentioning something along
Tetrapods.
Tetrapods.
Back in the early days, many millions of years ago, I think, in the Silurian period, there were obviously these famous fish. They were called Tiktaaliks, and they obviously did that thing you've seen in many cartoons where they drag themselves out of water and onto land. And they did this with the use of 4 limbs. And it's that evolutionary throwback which has lasted all the way until today with all of its descendants. All land vertebrates have 4 limbs.
So there's not a single land vertebrate with more, and that's including birds, lizards, mammals. No one has more than 4 limbs, because the tail.
Even whales.
Even whales, because
They have vestigial hip bones, but they're still there.
Okay, so and tails don't count as limbs then.
No, that's just an extension of the tail.
Well, there you go. So effectively, we were desperately trying to think of a way to stick wings on the back and make it work. However, there was this rather famous statement made about angels. And it was along the lines of, if a human was to have avian wings stuck on its back, the muscles required to actually give it flight would mean its chest would come out about 1 meter, making it just enormous and incredibly impractical. Now, that's not really an issue in birds, is it? They're really proportioned quite well.
Yes, their whole body is designed for flight. They've already got the large sternum, which is designed to house all of that muscle. And of course, they've got, quite famously, the hollow bones to actually require less of that muscle to help them fly with ease.
Of course, but then the issue comes in even in birds, their wings are 2 of their limbs. They still have that 4-limbed thing. So unfortunately, against the mythology, we've had to kind of make its front limbs of this griffin into the wings haven't we?
Yeah.
Where rather than having it on its back, we still wanted to keep it in that traditional sense of it almost looking like a bird on the front half, a cat on the back half. But in order to do that and give it flight at the same time, because one of the thoughts we had was rather hilariously linked to flying squirrels.
Yes, I postulated the ridiculous idea of having a lion maybe jump off some great precipice and stick its arms out with its legs, with a big flap of skin between it like a flying squirrel, and that just looks ridiculous.
And it was even further from the mythos than we got now, so the only real way to give it flight was to replace those front limbs with wings. So we were talking about ways to make it still an intimidating presence on both land and in the air, and have it be able to walk around and give off that almost half bird, half cat image.
Well, it's been known for creatures in the past and the present even with the front limbs are wings and using them as walking limbs, for example. More famously, there are the pterosaurs from the Mesozoic era, which had these ridiculous wings. Unlike birds, they were derived from the little finger, which had extended out to this ridiculous length, and the flap of skin was evolved around it, so that the hand was in the middle of... They actually had a fully formed hand in the middle of the wing, so they could just put that on the ground and walk along quite normally. But also there's something quite similar today in New Zealand. There's a population of flightless bats. They eat things like the flightless crickets in the forests there, so they've absolutely no need to fly. They just sort of climb up the trees, and they just they still have wings, just not the power to use them as wings, so they just scrabble about on the ground using their wings.
Okay, and that's very good for, like, for example, you mentioned the pterosaurs and these bats who have almost like hands within their wings.
Yes.
However, in avian species and in birds, they tend to just have almost like an elbow joint as the thing of their wings. Is there any like stage in the evolution of birds when they still had almost like a hand-like thing, but yet had some flight ability?
Well, actually, there's something quite like that today. Have you heard of the hoatzin?
I have not.
It's a bird that lives in South America, and it's people would describe it as primitive, but it's evolved recently, so it doesn't really count as being primitive in a scientific sense. But it has claws. In fact, actually, when you're eating a chicken wing, if you look at the bone structure, you can see it has a little claw there. But that's of the hoatzin. It's so well pronounced that when it falls out of its nest, they can quite calmly swim to the edge of these mangroves and just climb up using this claw.
Okay, so if we give our griffin like an even more pronounced version of this claw,
yes,
this could not only be used to walk on, but could effectively be also used almost like a weapon for its front legs as well.
Yes.
Meaning that on land, it is still a intimidating presence and still able to hold its own. Because, of course, in mythology and in all of these fantasy series, griffins are, like, you know a character's cool when they fly in on a griffin. And you know that griffins are not to be messed with. So if we're going to keep it as like a large, intimidating, seemingly mammalian thing, having those like front limbs that are still able to be used on land while also providing flight is a really great thing. But there was also one other thing that we were thinking of in terms of the front half. Traditionally, they're eagles.
Yes.
Aren't they? However, you postulated an idea of almost basing it on another bird, didn't you? Yes. A vulture.
Yes, they're not that far off from eagles, really. But because we wanted the back half to resemble that of a lion, some eagles have got naked legs with very sparse feathers on their back half because they are constantly having to root around in carcasses. So it's much easier for them to have these naked legs, which are easier to clean than having blood and other such bodily substances in your feathers.
So rather than gunk up their feathers on their legs because they're wading around in dead bodies all the time, they've chosen to have these kind of naked legs. And that's almost applicable in two ways, because the whole idea of we want that distinction between feathers at the front, fur at the back. And we were thinking of ways to get around that, as well as the fact that, if I'm not mistaken, in fact, I was watching this the other day, a documentary on condors, and in which it said that they are very closely related to vultures.
Yes.
And condors are one of the biggest birds of flight, if not the biggest, are they not?
The biggest that are alive today, yes.
And they are huge and very vulturous. So that actually comes into play with the whole idea of our griffins being big enough for, say, a teenage wizard to ride it. So that's quite interesting in having the naked legs. However, lions aren't traditionally known for being naked. They tend to be rather furry instead. And in terms of furry birds, there's one that immediately jumps to mind, and that's the kiwi.
Yes.
And why has the kiwi evolved to be fluffy rather than feathery?
Well, in its sort of ecological niche, the kiwi is basically New Zealand's version of the badger.
That's incredible. So how are they like badgers?
It lives in burrows. It feeds on mostly insects. It eats a lot of worms, and this. Of course, there's this fur, which have led many people to call the kiwi an obligate mammal. Basically, what happened is, because it's so flightless, even the wings have reduced to little stumps, which are in this massive, feathery fur. Yes, puff. Basically, feathers are adapted for being streamlined and helping use wind currents to fly effectively. But when you're flightless, they're just going to become somewhat degraded and no longer resemble a feather that you would pick up when walking in the woods.
Okay, so effectively, these are still feathers that a kiwi has.
Yes.
However, they have almost become like fur.
Yes.
And that's very good for us because it makes our job of making one half feathery and the other part furry much easier. So this idea of fluffy legs as well as naked legs led us into thinking about another species of bird, which is called the fishing eagle. And then what the fishing eagle does is rather obvious because, well, it's in the name, it fishes. And what it does is, using its incredible eyesight, it swoops down to rivers and plucks out fish with its hind legs. And its hind legs, its only legs.
Yes.
And its legs are naked and fluffy in places because while vultures don't want to get all gunked up with blood, getting water in your feathers isn't always great either, is it?
It's very impractical.
Which is why ducks are waterproof, isn't it?
Yeah, they've evolved special layers of feathers to help cope with these great amounts of water. Like if you look at a duck on a drizzly day, it's got little beads of water on its outer feathers, keeping its insulating feathers completely dry. It's absolutely fascinating.
So insulating feathers, is that why they want to keep their feathers dry rather than keeping them, getting them wet?
Yes, because once they get wet, it can be very problematic, and it can lead them to be very cold. And because it's under the flight feathers, this can last a very long time.
Okay, so we were thinking that it is very much possible that the back half of our griffin has in fact evolved to be fluffy in order to be able to pluck fish or possibly larger prey right out of the water, such as the reason for it needing a beak. I mean, we've already stated it's evolving from birds, but another question that I had was, if we're making it like a lion bird, why would it still need a beak?
Well, a beak is much stronger for cracking open things than the jaws that us mammals have got. For example, look at the size of our heads. We've got quite big heads compared to that of a parrot.
Especially you.
Thank you.
Anyway, compared to that of a parrot.
Compared to that of a parrot, I cannot crack a great big walnut with my mouth. A parrot with its tiny head, which is probably about the size of my clenched fist, can crack a walnut because of the way that a beak is structured. It's simply much better for applying pressure than that of the jaws we have.
So beaks are effectively much better suited at tearing apart fish and maybe breaking turtles if it needed to be.
Yes, another prehistoric example, that commonly known as terror birds. Now, going back to what I said about a parrot's head being about the size of my clenched fist, the height of the terror bird's skull is bigger than the height of my apparently large skull. And if you think about how big that beak is, it's adapted for cracking something a lot harder and a lot bigger than nuts. For example, bones.
Which would yet again be a big problem for anything that the Griffins put its sights on. So this combination of beak and fluffy legs is perfect for fishing, but at the same time, its ability to be on land, to be a threat on land, still means that it could effectively hunt on the land as well, which is very, very good for a traditional griffin. Now, we've got a few more things we want to talk about in terms of the griffins, as in how they're flying, where they're going to live, and their ability to link into this mythology, which I think we should possibly talk about after a short break.
Yes, let's go on a break. I'll eat biscuits during the break.
Yeah, have a quick biscuit break and a glass of water, maybe a cup of tea, and we'll be right back with you as soon as that's done.
It's now the mash.
It's now the Monster
The
Mash.
Monster Mash.
And it's a graveyard
It's now
smash.
the mash.
It's caught on in a flash.
It's now the mash.
Hello and welcome back to the show. In the first half, we have broken down quite a bit of what makes a griffin and some changes we've made. For example, rather than a traditional eagle, we've taken almost like a fishing eagle / vulture route in order to make it a fish-eating bird, as well as giving it land capabilities despite not having 6 limbs and thus keeping it typically tetradon.
Tetrapod.
Tetrapod even.
Don means foot, Don means tooth.
Oh, so 4-tooth that would be.
Yes.
So tetrapods then. So yeah, now we're back. We've got a few more little bits we want to discuss about, with more comparisons to other real-life creatures, as well as some talk on the habitat.
Yes.
So what was the other bird you were thinking of as a point of comparison?
The albatross.
The albatross.
I believe it's the largest flying bird alive today.
Condors?
At least one of the largest.
Regardless, it's a real big bird.
Yes.
And how is the albatross a point of comparison for our griffin?
Well, we've said our griffin is probably going to live off fish, and the albatross is a seagoing bird. I'm sure you've heard this many times before, and as have our listeners probably. Because the albatross is so large, it expends so little energy that it mostly relies on wind currents to fly, that it can spend 10 years on a single flight.
That's incredible. And also, with that whole largeness thing, whilst our griffin will be able to have traditional flight, that ability to ride air currents would be very useful. Very useful. Because even though we're going to give it a traditional bird like hollow bones and stuff, it will still, being the muscular thing it is, be very heavy. So
And the albatross is still quite well adapted. It's still quite toughly built to deal with all that knocking of the sea winds.
So is there any other ways we could compare the albatross to our griffin here?
Yes, so we'd like to have our griffin soaring across great distances using thermal current, and this sort of habitat, it's a vast area. These, as I said, 10 years flight, covering whole oceans in that time, and they can very easily circumnavigate the globe. So it's going to have a very large range, meaning it's a very adaptable animal.
So this would mean when it's on land, it would most likely have to rest on islands that it's come across, and need that like height to try and get a good flying start, which is another way where almost a mammalian back can come in. So cats, as we know, if you own one, or have you seen like one running around, or even stuff like, for example, cheetahs and lynxes, cats are incredible runners and also very good jumpers. So this back half allowing a very good running start and a good launch in order to get them into the air, especially if they're going from a height on an island to begin with, will allow for this really giant thing to fly a lot easier, wouldn't it?
Yes. Have you ever observed crows running?
I have not observed a running crow.
It's quite comical. They have this sort of side-to-side bob as they go along, and it's not that efficient on the ground, whereas mammals have a running technique which is completely unlike any other, because a lot of mammals come 4 legs but have got an upright stance. They can sort of gallop. I mean, if you look at, we wouldn't normally describe a lion as galloping, but in this sort of technical sense with the movement of the backbone, that is galloping. And it's from that because the whale is still a mammal, it moves its tail up and down, whereas if you look at something like a fish or a crocodile, they always move from side to side.
Okay.
And that's because they haven't adapted to have this these straight upright legs, which then allow for the movement of the backbone to go up and down. Otherwise they just move side to side. If you watch a lizard running,
this could link in, because despite making our griffins strictly avian, we could almost give them a skeletal structure,
yes,
especially in the back half, similar to that of a
to allow that
mammal.
undulating pattern.
To allow that undulating pattern. But also I was thinking that because it's got these front legs that are wings, it might struggle with the run slightly more than a mammal, but still, at the edge of a cliff, that back leg launch would be really beneficial for it.
Absolutely.
But that comes into it. As I just mentioned, we are keeping our griffin strictly avian. We are saying it evolved from birds. It is essentially, despite its looks, it is a bird. But that brings in one of the things that we were actually, when we very first started thinking about this, when we were initially thinking of a bird-mammal hybrid, the benefits of having a mammal back hind was live birth, you said. Would you care to diverge into that a little bit?
Yes. if we really wanted birds to give live birth, they're of course famous for having eggs. I mean, I bought some on Sunday, and but it is still possible to have an egg and give live birth. It's a trait called ovoviviparity.
Ovoviviparity, and that's how can someone have an egg and give live birth?
Well, it's been shown in different species of shark and some species of chameleon, by which the mother retains the egg inside the body. The egg hatches still inside the body, and the baby comes out the cloaca later.
So effectively, there are animals which have eggs but don't lay them.
Yes, that's essentially what happens.
So can you, like, for example, one that jumps to mind where I'm thinking of this is sharks, where a lot of people confuse sharks for having live birth, where in fact they just have their young hatch inside them.
Yes, tiger sharks, they have several different eggs, and whichever one hatches first eats all the other eggs.
Oh,
that's quite horrific.
Brutal. And is there any other examples that you can think of that I might not have heard of?
There's a species of chameleon, which ovoviviparous. They're not quite as vicious as sharks. They all sort of live quite happily. They have a sort of goopy ball around them when they're born. And this goopy ball, because chameleons live almost entirely in trees, so what the mother does, it climbs up quite high, and this ball of amniotic fluid helps to stick onto trees so that the chameleons can sort of go off as they please.
That's distinctly less brutal, but a hell of a lot more gross. So we were thinking of this could be a way to have it so it's a bird, but it gives live birth, but we were actually a bit misinformed. Upon doing some research, in fact, in the break we just had, we found out that in pretty much every recorded instance of griffins, they lay eggs. More notably, they tend to lay like one egg at a time, and that includes all sorts of interpretations, including Harry Potter, Dungeons and Dragons, and World of Warcraft.
And do you know something very interesting about World of Warcraft?
I know a few interesting things.
Well, if we were to accumulate all the time that had ever been played on World of Warcraft, do you know how much time it would amount to?
Is this all the time between like all the hours that every single player on there has been added together?
Yes.
I really don't know.
5 million years. Just to put that in perspective, 5 million years ago, apes hadn't started walking upright.
So we have effectively spent, as a species, we have spent more time playing World of Warcraft than we have existed.
Yes.
Jesus Christ. Anyway, so yeah, notably griffins all lay eggs, and one that really stuck out in my mind was this Harry Potter one, where they said that a griffin will lay one egg which will hatch within 24 hours.
Yes.
Now, could that possibly link into this thing you were just talking about, the
ovoviviparity.
Ovoviviparity, where the egg doesn't quite hatch in the parent, but they lay it and it almost hatches straight away.
Yes, I think that's very feasible. I mean, some sharks do it, and obviously the egg does form around the embryo inside birds anyway, and then they lay the egg, and it's really just a case of how much time is there in the incubation period. I mean, I've got up here looking at albatrosses. They lay a single solitary egg. They incubate it for around 70 to 90 days.
Compared to 24 hours, that's quite a long time. So rather than like a traditional bird egg, griffins would probably lay like a gross squishy egg, wouldn't they?
Yeah, reptiles have got quite leathery eggs, and of course amphibians don't even have a shell on their eggs, they've just got frog spawn.
So it would likely come out as either like a leathery reptilian egg or almost like a fleshy, gross egg similar to the shark eggs.
Yes.
And the baby griffin would rip out of that within a day.
And interestingly, shark eggs, little teaser for the next episode, are sometimes referred to as mermaids' purses.
Ooh, mermaids' purses. That is a bit of a teaser for next episode. Anyway, all spoilers aside, we do have to look at one last thing in concerns to our griffin, and that is what goes on its butt. Now, traditionally, like I said, they have lion back halves. Now, we've looked into it, and we said it will appear mammalian. We said it because that will help it launch off. It will help it catch fish, because, for example, lion paws with claws or a similar thing would be very good for nabbing fish out the water and stuff like that. However, there's one thing we haven't really talked about, and that's its tail. Giving it a lion tail might prove more problematic than when you first think of it, wouldn't it?
Yes, the lion tail is quite adapted for living in a hot environment where it can swat flies, it's not got much fur on it, which from a flight perspective is very impractical. As if you watch a bird flying, it will span out its tail, and that's because they sort of move their tail well twist it from side to side to help steering. It acts like a rudder, which you'd get on boats to help move about and navigate through the oceans. And it catches onto the air currents and then helps to move along in whatever direction it pleases. So it would have to have enough feathers to do that. So
feathers are important enough already in birds, but in a bird like ours, which would rely on catching air currents in order to travel great distances, even more so. However, there's one thing I was thinking, in order to almost, as with a lot of the creatures we've designed, if we can't make it look exactly like that, we can get as close as possible, almost providing an illusion of making it look like that. And something that jumps to mind immediately is peacocks' folding tails. Is there the possibility that despite having its wide tail feathers, it could fold down and almost look just like a normal tail until it unfurrows?
Absolutely. I doubt it would look anything like a peacock's. There's no way that it would be as long as a peacock's and be practical, because that's purely for display.
Not at all.
But yeah, there are some birds with quite long tails, which I suppose from a distance could look quite thin from the side. Maybe a little bit furry, but I doubt that would be feasible. But certainly thin and straight, like that of a lion's tail.
So there's only one more thing that I really want to talk about, and it's probably going to be a rather short point, but I figure it'd be a nice one to close out. Now, I mentioned very briefly earlier that if in a video game or a movie someone flies in on a griffin, you know they're cool.
Yes.
Riding on birds or having a almost like domesticated relationship with a bird, similar to one would have with a horse or a dog, for example, it seems very possible, doesn't it?
Yes, birds are quite intelligent animals. Of course, humans can have quite close bonds with birds. I'm sure you've seen many videos on things like Facebook or Twitter of somebody with their pet parrot or cockatoo, and they're just responding so lovingly. In fact, I was back when I was at college. There was this enormous black cockatoo called Monster, and the reason he was named Monster was because of his call. It was like hell vocalized.
That's amazing. And whereas normally riding a bird probably wouldn't be a great idea, even if it was big, we've given it a similar bone structure to mammals, which means that theoretically,
yes,
if one existed, despite its hollow bones, because of the muscle strength that it had, it could support person, possibly.
If we made it big enough.
If we made it big enough, or alternatively, if we gave it a small enough rider,
yes,
similar to how jockeys work in the real world.
If you recall, there was a picture that went viral a few months ago of a stoat riding, I think it was a woodpecker.
I do remember that. I do remember that image. The stoat had jumped onto the woodpecker to try and eat it, but ended up going on a bit of a joyride instead.
Yes, I remember the facial expression of the woodpecker. It looked terrified and
I do not.
But it was still able to fly.
But it was still able to fly. So much like that, very confused stoat and very scared woodpecker, you could soar onto the battlefield on one of our griffins. So there we have it. We have a fully avian griffin, keeping it four-limbed with the wings on the front legs, but our back legs,
they're still quite lion-esque,
in order to help propel it and give it a good edge on land as well. It would fly from island to island and eat fish. It would be pretty terrifying, and in all honesty, I feel like if we came across this in real life,
we would probably die.
So that's pretty much it for the show. Thank you very much for listening, and let's not play God.